morning this Good Friday. Welcome to the Morning Momentum. I am your host, Alfonsoh. This is a daily compendium of local and international news, human interest stories, current affairs, and expert opinion. Let's take a look at the papers and get in depth with the top stories making the headline. Today, our big question will be, should Ruto and Raila hold talks? Should Ruto and Raila hold talks? You can keep interacting with us via our social media platforms at Younib_TV on Instagram, Younib Media TV on Facebook and on YouTube. And you can also send in your feedback via our SMS line 0719144144, and we'll be able to sample your sentiments in the middle of this broadcast. Let's start with the Standard newspaper, and the top story here: under attack, Kenya fights cyber hackers. Now, critical financial, banking and telecommunication infrastructure hit by hackers, raising fears on the safety of electronic information. Yesterday, the government assured of normalcy, but Kenyans are asking hard questions. That story is beefed up for you on page 4. At a glance, a group calling itself Anonymous Sudan claims responsibility. ICTCS Eliud Owalo confirms attack but says no data was stolen. Telecommunication giant Safaricom confesses to having challenges as well. Interior Ministry confirms momentary disruption caused by attempted cyber attack. National Cyber Security Committee had warned of targeted attacks on critical infrastructure installations. E-Citizen platform through which citizens access government services was the most affected. Also, another story making the headline: Ruto-Raila teams line up agenda for impeding talks. That story is beefed up for you on page 6. On page 12, taxi driver speaks on the day he carried Sharon's killers. And also, yes, I married an American, says woman in Nyachai case. That story is beefed up for you on page 3 of today's Standard newspaper. On sports, inside Kenya's marathon team to Budapest. Sports page, that is on page 30 and page 31. We'll also take a look at some expert opinion at page 13. And now let's delve into the Standard newspaper. You take a look at page 3. Woman seeking a child wealth admits marrying an American. Margaret says she married Totten to get books and grants. She also admits entertaining another man because he was dangerous and could hurt her. You can read that story on page 3 of the Standard newspaper this morning. On page 4, E-Citizen hit as 3-day outage leaves Kenyans in the dark. Just 4 weeks after President William Ruto launched the E-Citizen platform, it has experienced a significant and a prolonged outage, leaving Kenyans without access to government services. You can get to read that story on page 4. Also, alarm as hackers target state offices in brazen cyber attack. ICT Cabinet Secretary admits attempt to hack and assures Kenyans data is safe. Group calling itself Anonymous Sudan claims responsibility for the attack. Now, there are tips here of 10 ways to prevent cyber attacks. We take a look at some few. Keep the software updated, use strong passwords, firewall and network security, among many others. You can catch that story on page 4 of the Standard this morning. On page 6, who sits on truth's table and what to talk about divides Azimio team. Some feel a deal to share spoils has already been arrived. Leaders want Raila Ruto to only provide leadership for the broad-based talks. You can catch that story on page 6. On page 7, Ruto disburses 32 billion Kenya shillings to counties, says all revenue balances cleared. Now, the government would also disburse 2.3 billion shillings to all cash transfer beneficiaries. Ruto said the government would issue an international tender to help commercialize Lamu Depot. You can read that story on page 7. of today's Standard newspaper. Let's take a look at another story on page 8. Kin of student who drowned in Canada seek help to bring body. 23-year-old Brian Kiprop left Kenya 4 years ago to pursue university education. Family has asked the Canadian authorities not to cremate the body. That story is beefed up for you on page 8 of today's Standard newspaper. On page 10, court terms new police PS position against law. Setback for Bernice Lemedet, who had clinched the job. Petitioner says the position would duplicate the role of the PS. You can read that story on page 10 of the Standard newspaper. Let's take a look at page 12. Taxi driver narrates how he was hired to kill, how he was hired to ferry Sharon's killers. Jackson Gakombe says he learned of Sharon's death through the news on TV. He left witness protection after conditions became unbearable. Now, let's take a look at that story a little bit. A taxi driver has narrated how he was hired to ferry the alleged killers of university student Sharon Otieno. Jackson Otieno Gombe testified that he did not even know that he had carried the killers from Rongo town to the killing forest in Oyugi's town. More of that story is beefed up for you on page 12 this morning. On page 13, after gun scare, Prezo UK offers scribes meat without meat wrappers. There's a quote here: "It's hard to believe he was the president of Kenya for 10 years, said the youngest political analyst in town, who also happens to be the oldest man in our household." You can read that story on page 13. Another top story here: Pauline Njoroge writes what she likes and you can't do anything about it. You can read that article on page 13 as well, under expert opinion. Still on matters opinion, political chessboard, explore other options of solving presidential election disputes. Kenya must explore non-violent approaches to post-election presidential grievances to argument the judicial approach of the Supreme Court of Kenya. You can also catch that story on page 14. Moving to page 15, this is where our question for the day comes from. Should President and Raila now hold talks? Now, Kimeo, who is a city businessman, says yes, for the sake of Kenya, let them talk. Stacy Mwangi, a student at the Catholic University of Eastern Africa, says no, we can all predict what Raila wants. Now, this is our big question for the day, and we also want to know what you think about this. Should President and Raila now hold talks? Keep interacting with us through our socials and through our SMS line right there on your screens, and we'll be able to sample your sentiments in a few. Let's take a look at more expert opinion right here. Make fight against tuberculosis as robust as the one against HIV. That's on Matters World TB Day. That story is beefed up for you on page 16. For those who love motors, you can catch the article of the Digger Motor Show right here on the Standard. It has an amazing insight on matters motoring as well. For those Pulse lovers, it's also in here for you. Let's take a look now at some business news. Kenya between a rock and a hard place amid economic headwinds. Treasury CS Ukraine conflict. Treasury CS says Ukraine conflict has slowed the economy, accelerated inflation. AFDB project East Africa region's economy to grow by 5.1% this year. Also on matters borrowing, U.S. Central Bank raises interest rates to highest in 22 years. You can read that story on page 19. And now we shift gears to some international news. Russia-Africa Summit. West wary as Putin seeks to extend influence. European and US policymakers until recently saw China as their main competitor in Africa, but now they find themselves observing with deep unease Russia's assertive return, epitomized by the presence of Wagner machineries in the continent. You can read that story on page 21 this morning on the Standard newspaper. Also, captive president defiant after Niger coup. Banzoum is a key Western ally in the fight against Islamist militants. His foreign minister has said the takeover does not have the backing of the whole military. You can get to read that story on page 22 on the Standard this morning. Let's now take a look at some sports news, and then we proceed with the other stories on the other papers. Now, football, Nigerian Falcons fly over Australia. That story is on page 32. We'll take a look at it. Golf, Weekend Golf Club draws. The results are beefed up for you on page 29. You can take a look at that as well. And on page 30, will Kenya's marathon squad dethrone defending champs in Budapest? Ethiopia and Uganda, among other countries, have selected big shots in readiness for a tough contest. Kenyan men last won a world title on the roads at the 2017 World Championships. Kenya's marathon team to Budapest include Titus Kipruto, Joshua Belet, and Rosemary Wanjiru, together with Shailene Jep Korir. Those are the people who are going to represent Kenya in Budapest. We also have Timothy Rono and Sally Chep Yego. You can get to read that story on page 31. On the cover page of the Standard this morning, why Wambua cannot dare drop the ball. If there's one thing that former Mwamba RFC head coach Kevin Wambua, who was named the new Shujaa head coach, doesn't have, is time. You can read that story on the cover page of the Standard newspaper. Also, Nigerian Falcons fly over Australia. Oshoala volleyed into an open goal in the 72nd minute to seal vital. Nigeria stand hosts Australia 3-2 in the ongoing Women's World Cup. 28 opportunities Australia created in their match against Nigeria. That story is beefed up for you on the cover page of the Standard newspaper. Let's now take a short break, and then we come back with the top stories on the Daily Nation this morning. Welcome back to the Morning Momentum. You are still rolling with your host, Alfonsoh. Keep interacting with us. The hashtag is the Morning Momentum. Let's take a look at the stories making the headlines on the Daily Nation this morning. The top story, the church is back. Current crop of clergy accused of taking political sides, turning sanctuaries into political pulpits. Voice of Reason, Alexander Muge, John Henry Okulu, Ndigi Mwana Anzeki, David Gitari, Timothy Njoya. These bishops stood out as men of God with a heart for justice. Fiery and fearless, they inspired public confidence while speaking out against the government of the day. Some of them even had to pay the price with their lives, but this was decades ago. Now, after a lull during which the church has taken a beating from all quarters, a new crop of bold clergy is emerging. That story is beefed up for you on page 4 and page 5. Another top story on page 7, Ruto Raila MPs clash over police brutality. And on world news, the Niger coup. World leaders condemn power grab by the Nigerian military. That story is beefed up for you on page 22. Also on page 3, how I stopped killer lioness. Masai elder narrates his encounter with a deadly predator. Also another top story on page 12. Kenyans suffer service delays as hackers strike. Kenyans were yesterday denied access to essential services such as buying electricity tokens, transacting on M-Pesa, digital banking, and various government services on eCitizen following a cyber attack targeted at both public and private institutions. Let's now take a look at the stories inside the Daily Nation. On page 2, Meta now launches subscription service for Instagram and Facebook. TechFarm is following in the footsteps of Twitter, now known as X. Verified users to get enhanced security, exclusive features such as stickers. You can get to read that story on page 2 of today's Daily Nation. On page 3, how a Maasai elder stopped a killer lioness in her tracks. Although happy to have survived the ordeal, Mzee Legay regrets the death of the lioness. The 60-year-old was responding to a distress call in Kimugandura village. That story is beefed up for you on page 3. Also another top story, 3 questioned over murder of 2 traders after phone data audit. Directorate of Criminal Investigations detectives are interrogating 3 family members in connection with the recent killing of 2 Narok-based business women. On page 4, religious leaders claim their space in nation's politics. The church is back. Current crop of church leaders has been accused of being a pale shadow of the pioneers, with some openly taking political sides and even turning their churches into political pulpits. You can get to read that story on page 4. Over the years, public confidence in the church has taken a beating over the cloud silence and controversial positions taken by some in the clergy, but this is now beginning to change. That story is on page 4 and page 5 of the Daily Nation this morning. On page 6, I stop BBI, I'll crash protest, says Ruto. President Ruto said he was willing to negotiate on everything else but the security of the nation and its people. BBI, a process spearheaded by Raila and ex-President Uhuru Kenyatta, was thrown out by the Supreme Court. This is a quote President Ruto spoke. I told you back then that God will help us to stop reggae, and I stopped. I have also said we will stop these demonstrations. That story is on page 4. On page that story is on page 6. Sorry, on page 7. Police clamp down on street protests, leaves MPs divided. The opposition has accused the government of hiding its failure to deal with joblessness by killing innocent demonstrators. Kenya Kwanza MPs claimed that Azimio had hired criminals to hide behind protests to instigate violence. You can read that story on page 7 of the Daily Nation this morning. On page 8, how Nairobi Water lost 10 billion shillings due to theft and faulty meters. City county representatives expected to launch investigations into the matter. You can read that story on page 8 of the Daily Nation. Let's move on to page 10. I married American to access grants, Nyachai's wife claims. She changed her children's names a few months after Nyachai died. Another top story right here, WHO updates its list of essential medicines for children and adults. The World Health Organization has updated its essential medicine list for adults and children. According to WHO, essential medicines, which are updated every 2 years, are those that satisfy the priority healthcare needs of a population. That story on page 10. On page 12, and this is the top story, key services unavailable as Kenya is hit by cyber attack. A group of cybersecurity experts had warned of an imminent attack. Interior Ministry last evening issued statement stating that all services on eCitizen had resumed. You can read that story on page 12 of the Daily Nation this morning. Let's take a look at some expert opinion why maandamano demos are disruptive, morally inept. Now, you can read all this story on page 15. There's a sentiment by Washira Kibanya who says, outcomes benefit none of the parties involved, but those whose harm spares nobody. That story on page 15. No demo relief to learners. The place of children is in school. That is also another opinion on page 15. Let's move on to some other stories right here. There is the DN2 article on Matters the Voice. You can read that also inside the Daily Nation. Let's shift gears and take a look at some county news this morning. Maragoli rides event to disrupt school calendar, that is in Vihiga County. Also on Matters Devolution, Wamatangi says revenue formula hurting Kiambu. CRA is in the process of developing new resource sharing formula. That story on page 19 of today's Daily Nation. Also in Mombasa, oil pipeline plan keeps city's water hopes alive. Pipeline will be disinfected and water tested for quality to ensure it is safe for drinking. That story on page 20. Let's take a look at international news this morning on the Daily Nation. Condemnation as Niger military seizes power. Patrice Talon, the president of Benin, was expected in Niamey on Thursday. Benzoum was elected in 2021, taking helm of country stepped in poverty. You can read that story on page 22. Also, Suluhu calls on investment in human capital. Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu Hassan on Wednesday urged African leaders to join forces and invest in human capital. 44 African countries represented at the summit. You can read that story on page 22. In North Africa, climate change, drought hit North Africa turns to purified sea water. Most desalination plants are powered by climate killers. Also another story, Putin hosts African leaders. The Russian president on Thursday hosted African leaders for a summit in St. Petersburg as the continent braces for the consequences of Moscow's withdrawal from the Ukraine grain deal. You can read that story on page 23. In China, Kim Jong-un, Sergei Shoigu to North Korea weapons exhibition centers. That is a story you want to catch on page 23 of the Daily Nation this morning. Let's take a look at business news. APA Insurance compensates toy market fire victims. That story on page 24. Also on Matters Agriculture. Chaos as coffee auction shut for fourth week in row. Government efforts to retrieve cash crops fortunes falter. Confusion reigns over issuance of trading permits to players by the government. That story is beefed up for you on page 24. And let's now take a look at sports news this morning on the Daily Nation. And we start with youth games. Young Lionesses say they aren't mere clubs. Final squad for Trinidad and Tobago is picked. Caribbean nation to host Commonwealth Youth Games from August 4th to August 11th. Also on Matters Volleyball, moment of truth for Malkia strikers. Malkia strikers face the game of their lives today when they come up against Colombia in the FIVB Challenger Cup knockout stage at the Espace Mayenne in Naval, that is in France. Or which way for African women's football future? In keeping with the spirit of Maandamano, today I have a canny proposal. How about we collect 10 million signatures to petition the German national women's team to be nicer to African World Cup debattances. That is a sentiment by Celestine Olilo, Women in Sports. Amateur match play at Great Rift Leisure Resort hosts Ladies Open. Lots at stake for winner, including tickets to next year's Kenya Open. You can read that story on page 33 this morning on the Daily Nation. Secondary school sports, Agoro Sare it is. Kisumu Day out. Homa Bay champs for nationals after rivals appeal against win ejected. That story on page 34 of the Daily Nation this morning. On page 35, Oshaola seals famous Nigeria win, African glory. Barcelona star comes on as substitute to score crucial goal from acute angle. Hosts miss chance to reach last 16 in front of 49,156 fans. Face a must-win final group game against Canada. You can read that story on page 35 on the Daily Nation this morning. Let's take a look at the cover page, and it's all about unions. Save workers from high power bills, consumer interests. Atwoli calls for workers to be represented in the Energy Regulators Board. Medics Association says hospitals will be forced to increase fees to cover power costs. You can read that story on the cover page of the Daily Nation. I want us to now sample your sentiments based on our question for the day. The question for the day was, do you think Ruto and Raila should now hold talks? Now, let's take a look at your sentiments. Moses Munene says on matters Finance Act and Economic Management, yes, that is Moses Munene. Kinyanjui Wagitau says, if only when they meet the high cost of living will come down, which is doubtful. There is a person who goes by the name DKM says, Raila cannot hold talks with leadership of a rogue and illegitimate government. He cannot be an accomplice. George Muita says, of course, after 2027 elections, right now he should be correcting the government, expecting nothing in return. Edwin Obi Anduro says, yes, if he believes Kenya belongs to all of us. There is a guy by the name Obama says, Kenya is a democratic country and our president is identified through a vote. We did so on 9th August 2023, and we expect to see his success or failure before we decide on his fate in 2027 election. Why would William Ruto and Raila Odinga negotiate on anything before then? That is Obama. Son of a teacher says, talks on what? He should listen to Kenyans and repeal Finance Bill 2023. Hiyo ya talks hukua political trickery. We have been down that road before and it led us to a useless BBI. Many thanks for choosing to stay with us. Thank you for your feedback. And we want to come to an end at that particular moment. We want also to appreciate you for the support you are showing Younib TV. Keep watching Younib TV. I have been your host this morning on the Morning Momentum, Alfonsoh. Many thanks also to those who made this broadcast a success. Brian Ngoha behind the cameras, Elias Muchina on the directing side, and Anifa Kavira on the controls. See you on Monday morning, same time, same place. Until then, have a good Friday.
Ngoha.